Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Maria Murphy, and I'm the Interim Associate Director of the Alice Paul Center here at Penn. And I would like to begin our event today with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement, for anyone who may not be familiar with the practice, often takes place at the beginning of lectures, ceremonies, and public events such as this keynote talk. To acknowledge is one small way to show respect to Indigenous peoples and their enduring connection with their traditional territories and its histories. In an effort to recognize both the historical and ongoing practices of colonization, we wish to affirm that the Alice Paul Center and Program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Penn occupies the traditional unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape people. We wish to acknowledge the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together in this community that, while virtual today, is based out of Philadelphia. Our year at the center, dedicated to environmental feminisms, is part of an ongoing effort to recognize our own individual and institutional place in settler colonialism, and to better understand the relationship between Indigenous knowledges, climate activism, and relations with and within the environment broadly conceived by engaging these ideas alongside other environmental feminist work more broadly throughout the year. Thank you. Today, it is my honor to introduce the first keynote speaker for Beyond Survival, Eco-Feminist Imaginings in Precarious Times. With generous support from the University Research Foundation, the School of Arts and Sciences, and Native American Indigenous Studies at Penn, this week's events are intended to address environmental feminisms through a broad range of perspectives and methods. Tonight, we welcome Cindy Wiesner, a 30-year veteran of the social justice movement in the US and internationally, who is the executive director of the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. She's trained as a union organizer and has been active in many movement-building initiatives, currently including It Takes Roots, the Rising Majority, Green New Deal Network, and the People's Bailout, among several others, and she's currently volunteering with the Frontline. She helped co-found the Climate Justice Alliance and played a leadership role in the People's Climate Movement that organized the massive mobilizations in recent years, and she's currently an advisor to Groundswell's Liberation Fund. Cindy is a lesbian of Salvadoran, Colombian, and German descent and a grassroots feminist, internationalist, and movement strategist, and lives in Durham, North Carolina. Responding to Cindy's talk today is Assistant Professor of English and GSWS faculty, Jennifer Ponce de Leon. Jennifer is an interdisciplinary scholar who's working across studies of contemporary visual arts, literature and performance, transnational Latinx and Latin American studies, Marxist aesthetics, and social theory, including anti-colonial and post-colonial thought. She's also faculty in Latin American and Latinx studies and cinema studies, and she was recently recognized for her distinguished teaching as the recipient of the 2020 SAS Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching by an Assistant Professor. I'm also really pleased to announce that Jennifer's book, Another Aesthetics is Possible, Arts of Rebellion in the Fourth World War, is coming out, I think, on Friday or very soon from Duke University Press. Focusing on artists and art collectives in Argentina, Mexico, and the United States, this book shows how experimental practices in the visual, literary, and performing arts have been influenced by and articulated with leftist movements and popular uprisings that have repudiated neoliberal capitalism and its violence. So you'll definitely want to check out her book from your local bookstore. I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. For folks who are watching on YouTube and Facebook, please feel free to make comments and ask questions, and we'll leave some time at the end to take those. Okay, I will turn the floor over to Cindy for the presentation towards an anti-racist, feminist, regenerative economy. Thank you, Cindy.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And saludos a todas, todex, everyone who's joining us to be part of this dialogue. And I'm really grateful to you, Professor Maria Murphy, and also to Professor Jennifer de Leon, and also the University of Pennsylvania, the Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender and Sexuality and Women, the Native American and Indigenous Studies at Penn, the Sachs Program in Arts Innovation, the University Research Foundation, and School of Arts and Science, and to all the tech folks also helping us with this, and everybody, all the sisters and brothers and kin folks that are here as part of this dialogue. Beyond Survival, Eco-Feminism in Precarious Times. And, you know, just what a moment. I was just reflecting about what moment we're in. It's been almost a little bit more than a month since the white supremacist, misogynist, xenophobe was escorted out of the White House by himself, like a rat with a tail between his legs. You know, in a real historic moment where a Black-led multiracial front really delivered defeat to this authoritarian, you know, sort of that was in power in the White House. And, you know, and I think it's a moment of still celebration, taking deep breaths, and then also pivoting, right? I was sharing that I feel like I've been as busy in the last couple of weeks with now the new administration, because we knew for many of us that this, you know, Biden was probably not our second or third or fourth or fifth choice, but we knew that it was very clear we had to defeat, you know, sort of the growing threat of neo-fascism, and not only for ourselves here in this country, but I think for around the world, and what that's meant for people to actually have one down. But also just really reflecting also yesterday on the recognition of over 500,000 people unnecessarily and prematurely passing away because of COVID, and the ineptitude of the Trump administration, and just the reckless behavior that was promoted and promulgated, and just the real loss, I think, in not only here, but all around the world, but just marking that moment that we're living in. So I'm really, you know, really happy to be sharing some of the work that I get to do on a daily basis with our member organizations, our allies across the world, and with just some really radical leading feminists that have been in construction, have been trying to really build and articulate what I'm about to share. So this is not just about me and what I'm bringing, but really delivering and sharing collective work that we've been in for the last almost decade. And I think that that's, I just want to make sure, I wanted to contextualize that. And so, but I always think it's important to start with the story of selves, to like politically locate yourself. And, you know, like Maria said, I've been in the movement now for over 30 years. And I was radicalized by the first Iraqi massacre in 1991. And I was also, you know, in the streets with the Rodney King uprisings. I'm originally from Los Angeles, a working class kid, daughter of a domestic worker. And, you know, I feel like that I was very politicized by the fight against police brutality and around the US imperialism and wars around and occupations around the world. I was also a student activist at UC Berkeley, where I got very involved in the fight for affirmative action and ethnic studies. And I got exposed to radical and revolutionary politics at that time, and very informed by feminist, you know, sort of women of color feminist, third world revolutions, and also the queer movement. And so I went on to become a labor and community organizer. And I feel like in a lot of ways that those pieces and those threads have been constant in the last 30 years to now, where I get to help, you know, coordinate a national alliance that's called Grassroots Global Justice. And so a little bit about the alliance that I'm with is that, you know, we were founded and come out of the anti-NAFTA fights, right? And the WTO battle in Seattle in 1999. And we started off as actually taking grassroots leaders, frontline leaders, indigenous, Black, Latinx, Arab, white working class folks to the second World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil. And that experience was very formative for not only the individuals, but also the determination to come back and build a movement building vehicle. And part of that begins the birth of Grassroots Global Justice, with roots in the environmental justice movement, in the anti-globalization movement, in the economic justice movement, racial justice movement. And within that, really being able to think about how are we creating an alliance that really builds a bridge with our international counterparts, right? Workers, feminists, environmentalists, campesinos, peasants, farm workers, and being able to really think about how is it that we begin to articulate and strengthen a grassroots organizing sector in this country with the context of really thinking about across race, across region, across issues, but then also being able to bring in and tie the what we call grassroots internationalism. And so within that, our work, our slogan is build no war, no warming, build an economy for the people and the planet. And that really has been some of our work campaigns against war and occupation, not only around the world, but also within our communities. And no warming in terms of really developing what we call a global well-being perspective around really being in right relationship with nature and thinking about how to think about not only sort of our fight for climate and environmental justice, but really a whole reframing of what it means to be in balance and living. And that concept of global well-being is our translation of Buen Vivir, which comes out of the Andean region, indigenous people struggles around really a whole cosmovision. And that term was coined by Tom Goldtooth of the Indigenous Environmental Network, who's one of the co-founders of Grassroots Global Justice. And then the last piece is really thinking about the economy, right? Economy for the people and the planet. And one of the things that it was in the last 5 years, we began through our work with international social movements, really were very informed by the very radical militant feminist movement around the world. Everywhere we went, when we went to social forums, we went to the UN climate negotiations, we went to, sort of fight against the WTO or the trade agreements. We always were connecting with social movements, international social movements, and a lot of them happened to be feminist and happened to be, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-racist. And part of what was interesting was that we began to have these conversations about it was no accident that in Grassroots Global Justice, many of the people that we represent it's a mixed gendered formation, and many of our mass-based organizations and membership are also mixed gendered. And one of the things that was interesting was always an overwhelming representation of women or gender nonconforming folks in leadership, not only at staff levels, but in elected leadership bodies, but also in the constituency around whatever issue that people worked on, whether it was like housing, immigration, environmental justice. And we started talking about how much we were very informed by racial justice. We were very informed by an anti-capitalist perspective, but that our gender analysis was actually a bit underdeveloped, even though the constituency and the leadership was explicitly women, was explicitly gender nonconforming in majority of ways, right? And I think that one of the things that we began to say was, what would it mean to actually strengthen that analysis and to really begin to reclaim feminism from the grassroots? And I think that embarked us in a whole journey that now leads us that we're now part of the World March of Women, which is an international feminist movement. We are also part of really beginning to articulate what does a feminist economy look like, and particularly being able to talk about it more explicitly as an anti-racist, regenerative feminist economy. So bringing in the pieces around our background and our DNA of our history in the environmental justice and climate justice movement, but also our commitment to fighting white supremacy and talking explicitly on the front end around anti-racism, anti-white supremacy, but also being able to claim very squarely that we are part of the feminist movement and that we believe that an antidote to this current system is that anti-racist, regenerative feminist economy. So with that, that's a little bit of story of like GGJ, how we came to this issue. And I think that I wanted to also share that story because it's not like we come out of the women's movement per se directly, or that we come out of, sort of that explicit feminist movement. A lot of us individually, a lot of us organization, very informed by feminist thinking and feminist ideology and practice, but it was something that we also came to very intentionally as something that we took on and did political education, did feminist organizing schools, and now we're at a place where we've done, national feminist organizing schools. We're now about to embark actually on an international feminist organizing school that's actually launching next week. And we've also coordinated with our sister alliance, Indigenous Environmental Network, to do, and the Black Mesa Water Coalition, to do an indigenous feminist organizing school. So all of this to say that, we have we see ourselves as part of the feminist movement. We are reclaiming that history, and we are basically taking it on from a very grassroots, bottom-up perspective, but also an international perspective around what that actually means at this moment. So with that, I want to start off actually naming that I shared that we're launching our school, our International Feminist Organizing School next week. And we're calling it actually the Berta Cáceres International Feminist Organizing School. And it has been next week on March 2nd, it's 5 years since her murder, right? And those of you who may not know Berta Cáceres, you should read about her, look her up. Amazing, amazing person. She was a land defender, coming from the Lenca people in Honduras, an internationalist, a feminist, social movement leader, and she was murdered, right, for protecting the river and protecting and fighting against the dams and fighting against corruption in Honduras. And she was murdered, and the family and the people in her organization, the COPIN, are still fighting for justice for Berta, and we have been part of that campaign. And Berta was a social movement leader that we came across in all of these global gatherings and learned from. And so I want to start with a quote to just remember her, because we're marking this 5 year of how her family calls of her seeding of her planting, because there's a great chant that we chant in the streets. It's like, Berta didn't die, she multiplied, and that we are all Berta. And so she started this quote. I read it all the time, and it's as a reminder, grounding. I want to share it with you all, which says, "Let us wake up, humankind. We are out of time. We must shake our conscience free from the rapacious capitalism, racism, and patriarchy that will only assure our own self-destruction." And I think with those words, it's like I take that very seriously, because it really means, it's like we have to understand the time, place, condition that we're in. We have to be strategic about our assessments. Like, how are we understanding the moment? How do we build coherence? How do we build alignment? How do we think about, sort of the diverse sectors of society? And in this moment, those like millions of people that have been radicalized because of the pandemic, because of the global uprisings in defense of Black lives, and because for those of us in the US, one of the most important elections in our lifetime so far, right? And at the same time, we live in a place of multiple colliding crises, right? What we saw and what we're seeing in Texas and across the Midwest and the Southwest in terms of these like polar vortex, what we see in terms of the floods, the hurricanes, right? Human-made, man-made disasters, and the economic crisis, right? That we're seeing. We're really at a crossroads of continuing, like, where is it that I think humanity is moving towards, like Berta says, right? And we see a trend around global authoritarianism. And we also see that there is a moment of like seeds of something new, right? Seeds of something new. And I think that for us, we are part of really believing that this is the moment to really think about the reorganization of society. Think about, like, because if you actually reflect what a year ago or 18 months ago seemed impossible, right? Seemed like not, oh, that's like pie in the sky ideas, or that's not tangible, right? We would be told, is now becoming common sense, right? It's now there's, moratoriums on rent and mortgages, right? Student debt cancellation, the freeing of people locked in cages, right, and jails and detention centers, workers being paid hazard pay, essential workers being visibilized, right, masses of people demanding people's bailout. The movement for Black Lives putting out a comprehensive vision called the Breathe Act. Many of us part of the Green New Deal, a bold demand around dealing with the ecological and economic crisis, Medicare for all, right? And we have to, this is a moment, I think, for us not only to reimagine a new model, but also not go back to what was considered normal, because that normal was destructive. What that normal was exploitative. What that normal was actually something that many of us fought against, right? And many campaigns, much work, both on a theoretical level, but also on a practical level. And I think what we saw was so clear was that it was what was invisible and what was undervalued, underpaid, like from things like domestic work, child rearing, food production, from people growing, selling it, to healthcare. It's what we would call reproductive labor, right? Is now completely visible, and in fact is what's been keeping us alive. But then we saw that the home became also a site of struggle, where all of the dynamics, gender division of labor, got either reinforced or challenged, and in a lot of ways, like people dealing with levels of violence and levels of abuse, and sort of the precarity, right, of the situation, many people being forced out of their home, many people in debt, many people sick. And so I think in a lot of ways, this has also been a moment of sort of these extreme polarizations, right? And I think women, in a lot of ways, if folks read the unemployment numbers for December, it's incredible, 156,000 job losses. And the estimation is that almost all of those were women that lost their jobs and filed for unemployment, right? And if we actually think about that, just like we don't even think about domestic workers or the sort of informal economy or sort of precarious, the other work that then gets done. Imagine all of the level of loss that's happened and the particular impact on women and gender nonconforming folks in particular. And so all of this to say is that this moment has been really shown us very dramatically, the choices we have. We either continue on the side of destruction, where if you put profit at the center, it will basically it's a model of death, right? And if you actually put life at the center and care at the center, it actually provides us a vision of a completely different vision. And so with that, I'm going to ask Maria to pull up the slideshow, and she's going to help me because I'm a light. And so I need some help here on this is exactly what this moment is about saying what you can and cannot do and how you need other people, right? So one of the things that I want to share is this piece that we're calling the anti-racist regenerative feminist economy. And so I just want to also say that I didn't get a chance to update the slides, but when I say that, that's when I mean feminist economy, that's what I'm meaning, right? And this the slide is also bilingual because we use it with our multilingual justice framework. And so people are going to see everything in English and Spanish. So basically for us, the feminist economy is our political proposal, right? And I think that that's how we're talking about it, is our political proposal for life. And really as an alternative, a systems change alternative to what is now. All right, so the next slide, please. So, but before I go into the components of the feminist economy, I do want to give a little bit of context for how the feminist economy as a framework and as a body of work came into being, and then where do we come in as social movements. movements, right? And ultimately, next slide, please. We see that, it's like our movement is long, right? And there's been multiple waves of our movement. And I would say now we're in the fourth wave, and we can have a whole conversation about that. But really that first wave of feminism, right? The sets of demands that I think women got organized at the beginning of the century, 20th century, was really talking about the right to women to have a job, to denounce labor and wage inequalities. And then, most commonly people know it as the right to vote. It's like this moment where we began to just see the massive mobilization of women, particularly women workers. And, and so much of like International Women's Day is because of like the Chicago, sort of strike and organizing of like the garment workers and then the tragedy that happened there. And it's like something that we're trying to also reclaim, right? But really thinking about that context, really around sort of labor and rights and in that. So moving on to the 1960s, right? We begin to see that there is this sort of, critique of sort of like, neoclassical theory of economics, and both like methodologically and empirically. But I think that we begin to have some feminists begin to articulate that there was, a sort of patriarchal formation of how we understood the economy, right? There was like very little context of how people understood basically work at home, right? And what we've then now reproductive labor. And there was a great article of, I believe it's in the New York Times, of Silvia Federici's work, and just like how much women organized around recognizing the unpaid labor at home, right? But this is the beginning of the 60s and 70s articulating and really having a critique of how classic, both, neoliberal sort of economics was being talked about, but also Marxist economics, right? Next slide, please. And then, throughout the 70s and 80s, there was this really important conference that happens it's called the Annual Conference of the American Economic Association. And that was the time when there was actually the first time a panel related to feminist perspectives in economics was actually had. And then there was some articles that then, based on that presentation, were published in 1993. And so imagine that, like how long it took to finally get from like the critique in the 60s to then this official, annual conference on economic association. But then this process really was the place that helped consolidate consolidated the creation for the International Association for Feminist Economics, right, in 1992 in the US. And really it was a space that was created to debate the current currents within feminist economists. And in 1995 published the magazine Feminist Economics. And this was like the first magazine of this nature. Then, and I think that, and researchers from all of that, were from different schools of economics, right? They were neoclassical, Marxist, functionalist, but also within various traditions of feminism, from liberal to radical to socialist, right? And there was just, like a lot of discussions about women's work and the concept of work and characteristics and functions, from domestic work to then, labor discrimination to economic policies, and how it was, things were differentiated by sex, gender, and development issues, right? But then there was then beginning to be sort of a critique that started to emerge in the early 2000s, in which, there was this, were social movements, also in the eve of like the fight back against the WTO, the NAFTA trade agreements, the free trade agreements of the Americas, or feminist organizations, particularly in Latin America, which was one in particular called the Network of Women to Transform the Economy. And in Spanish, the acronym is REMENTE. And then the World March of Women form, and they begin to bring this analysis into social movements, and particularly around the fight against the free trade agreements. And there was an emancipatory, like, political line that begins to be developed from this perspective, and then enters the conversation around the feminist economy, but with other kind of proposals coming from other movements, like La Via Campesina, which is an international peasant and campesino and farm work organization, with Friends of the Earth, with different folks. And it was also to create a different kind of trend from, like, the liberal feminist sort of perspective, which was about trying to include women in the treaties or around entrepreneurship without questioning the system, right? And so this is where I think there's, like, tendencies that then begin to kind of emerge, right? Which is what I would say, one is kind of like, how do you kind of think about feminist economy as a way of including women? And then one that is more, I would say, it ruptures with that framework, and a much more emancipatory framework, and being able to challenge it and actually replace the current system, right? The current racial and gendered capitalist imperialist system. So with that, next slide. So with that, we as GGJ are part of the latter, right? Within the sort of where we think about it, because and I told the story at the beginning about how it is that GGJ started this work, right? And how we're deepening the work within our membership, but also in conjunction with our social movement allies, not only here in the United States on Turtle Island, but also around the world. And part of, want to share what we think are some important components, right, around the feminist economy, right? And basically there's a couple, right, that really are important to share, which is, one is that it's a critique of the current economic system, and it's the study of the economy based on investment, productivity, capital, and time invested, right? So that I think that that's one important thing. It's really critiquing the way people understand economy and the values, and then the policies and the politics around it. Number two, it's a way of reclaiming the economy as management of home, which, eco-economy, if you break it down, and the root word is literally eco, which is management of home. And what we think about is our home, right? Our physical home, but also the planet that we live on. Next slide. Oh, next slide. So the third point is that it is a political proposal that reclaims our proposals, right, coming from women and gender nonconforming people's autonomy, that we believe that we gotta transform the systems of oppression we live in, and that it really puts a counter to that, right? That it is a system that it places sustainability of life at the center. And it's in dialogue with different alternatives, right? Different proposals that are coming from different movements, right? In terms of, like, from indigenous folks, the Buen Vivir, the concept of global well-being, to the campesino folks who have been talking about food sovereignty, to folks in the environmental justice movement and indigenous people's movement around energy sovereignty. So it begins to get articulated and starts to be in dialogue with all these different frameworks. And then the weaving is that part of the work of what we've been trying to do in this past period. Next slide. So for us, there's a couple of principles that are important to share, right? That I think is one that, we feel that there's many principles in the feminist economy. I'm going to share the four that we have right now. Is that part of the feminist economy cannot be seen in terms of the borders of the United States and the borders of, sort of artificial borders that are put forward. And it cannot be seen in the context of colonialism and imperialism, right? And that ultimately, if in fact we are going to have a very different economic model, it means having a different relationship and a different way of being, basically within a global context, right? And I think more and more we see, it's like we know the history of the United States, we know the history of intervention, we know the history of disruption, we know the history of destruction that our country has had on many peoples around the world, right? In our own territory here, but also within the continent, but also around the world. And that one of the important pieces is that what does it mean to actually think about the demands that we're articulating, not only from a US-centric model, but actually thinking about it in terms of the global dimension. And so one of the pieces of work that I'm really excited to share about is that we're part of this feminist foreign policy initiative, a feminist peace initiative with the Women Cross DMZ and Madre and a bunch of other amazing feminist leaders, majority women of color and gender nonconforming folks who are really trying to rethink what does it mean to be in solidarity? What does it mean to inform a policy from a very different perspective? And to be able to also break the binary between domestic policy and foreign policy and make those deeper connections. So next slide, please. The second piece is that, this is a core feminist articulation, is that we believe that a feminist economy needs to ensure bodily autonomy and self-determination as it relates to feminized, transgender, and gender nonconforming people, right? It's like the body as the first side of struggle in a lot of ways, but also the side of our resilience. And as Indigenous peoples talk about it as the first territory to defend, right? And in a lot of ways, this notion of being able to have, self-determination when it comes to choices about family, around how you want to express your gender, around how you work and want to be treated, and to then, state violence, state-sanctioned violence, like we saw in terms of, and what we know in terms of the deep history of police violence against Black people in particular, but Indigenous people, against migrants, and all of that, and how it's important it is, this concept of real importance of bodily autonomy and the sanctity of that, right? Next slide. That a feminist economy is really important component in, I had a lot of hopes for this, y'all, in the pandemic, which is about really socializing reproductive labor. And this point was really about saying that there is, in order for the system to work, right? In order for capitalism, racial and gendered capitalism to work, we need, a division, that it needs a enforced division of labor where traditional women's work is completely invisibilized, it's undervalued. And what we saw, like, very clearly, was how some of that, what's then being called essential work, became basically our bread and butter, right? The folks who were working at the grocery stores, the farm workers, the people in the meat producing industry. It's just like nurses, teachers, drivers, sort of folks in that. And then what happened at home, right? In the constructs of our home, how it is that we desperately need to socialize those divisions of labor, visibilize it, and be able to honor it, and be able to pay rightly, but rightly so and fairly so, but also to just see how important it is. Care work is so fundamental to our well-being and the planet's well-being. And I'll share some exciting news about a care resolution that we're a part of, that is going to be actually being put forward by Senator Warren and Congressperson Jamal Bowman, along with the Domestic Workers Alliance, that really begins to talk about the care economy and care work very fundamentally. But in this moment, this ability to re-socialize reproductive labor being really important. So we got a long ways to go there, but I think that's an important point. Next slide. The other piece is so fundamental, right? And then again, sort of what is happening in Texas right now. It's like being in right relationship to nature and Mother Earth is like super important, right? And our ability to not commodify nature, not put a price on water, not put a price on oil, not put a price on soil, and so many struggles coming from indigenous peoples, coming from people defending their land, sky protectors, water protectors, land defenders, paying with their lives, fighting the pipelines, fighting fracking, fighting sort of man-made disasters, and what we see what happened in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria, with Katrina, all of these things is that we're not in right relationship to nature, but a key component of the feminist economy has to put that in our approach to, again, values, politics, and policy. Next. So basically, this is just a little graphic that we have from our sisters in Guatemala that really just talk about, it's like food sovereignty is a way to actually confront capital and hunger and the pandemic, right? Being able to defend our seeds, right? To fight against GMO, to have people have the right to plant and to harvest, and the fact to be able to harvest water and to deal with what, as we know, these water wars are happening, and what we see in Texas happening, people boiling snow to have water to drink, and water to cook or bathe. And so I just think that one of the things that's just so important is that we have to begin to move towards a different way of life. And I think that that's what also the feminist economy is really giving us, that opportunity to think about, one, ancestral ways that our folks have survived, but also new ways that are not based on what we call false solutions or geoengineering or tech fixes, sort of like these false solutions that are being promoted by Elon Musk or sort of like people who got us into this mess, but real sort of locally based, ways in which we're going to have to really think about food and care in a dramatically different way. Next slide. So here's a video that I want to show, and I want to just make it real, right? Because these could be big ideas, but I want to be able to say these are some sisters in Brazil, and they're part of the Siempre Viva organization, the SOF in Brazil, which is a longtime feminist organization. They're part of the World March of Women, and they're doing this very deep, intentional work with farm worker women, campesina women, around food sovereignty, but really explicitly talking about the feminist economy. So if you can show the video, we're going to see about 4 minutes of it as a way to be able to, again, bring this framework together around the feminist economy in practice. And now.
Não conversar, que ficar dentro de casa, fico pensando naquela dor, que tá aquela dor. Daí sai, vai fazer um mutirão, esquece da dor que elas estão.
The feminist economy opposes this model of destruction and exploitation. Guaranteeing the sustainability of life, that is, creating and maintaining the basis for the existence and reproduction of life, is at the heart of the feminist economy. One way of understanding the sustainability of life is by looking at it in layers. Some layers are visible, because society sees them as part of the economy, while other layers are invisible. The invisible layers are what actually sustains life, but they are generally seen as being non-economic in nature. The invisible layers include nature. We ourselves are part of nature. All the material basis that is necessary for the reproduction of life comes from nature. The domestic sphere, the sphere of care work. Nearly all the work to satisfy people's essential needs is done in the domestic sphere. It is where we grow up and learn to interact with others throughout our entire lives. This sphere is invisible, yet it demands a lot of time, work, energy, and emotional availability from women. Community. Communities are built on social relationships based on mutual help, cooperation, and reciprocity. But the structure of some communities may be based on patriarchy, and thus on inequalities and multiple forms of exclusion. Even so, they may be a good place for building what we call the commons, that is, things that do not belong to our own private sphere, nor to the public sphere or to companies, and that we build collectively. The state. The state is responsible for providing a significant share of public goods and services for society as a whole, such as social security systems, for example. The state may take on different forms in different places, but nowadays, in most parts of the world, the state serves the interests of only a few and is not at all democratic. The market. The market is almost always guided by the drive to maximize investors' profits. Although most markets are like this and strive at all costs to regulate themselves, they can be made to work according to the logic of communities and to serve the goals of society as a whole. For example, they can be organized so that their main goal is to sustain life. Production. Production refers to the activities seen as real work that produce goods and services for companies, and people are paid to do them. In capitalism today, production work is carried out by both men and women, who are often subjected to high levels of exploitation. Financialization. This is a way of making money from financial transactions with no work involved. It is overvalued in today's economy, but contributes nothing to the reproduction of life. If what sustains life is the invisible part of the economy, then we can only conclude that the capitalist economy today, which is based entirely on the pursuit of profit, is itself contrary to life. This is why we talk about the conflict between capital and life, and that to build a feminist economy, we need to break away from this structure, overthrow the system, and consolidate an economic model that puts life first. The feminist economy is present in the practices developed every day by women who are fighting for land and to defend their territories, women who are putting agroecology into practice, and women fighting for the recognition and redistribution of domestic and care work. But it is also a utopia. It's the way we would like to organize the whole economy and society. To do this, we need to turn our outrage into political action, build feminism as a basis for a new society, organize a movement that seeks to change the lives of all women, and not only a few. We must strive to build a world where guaranteeing the sustainability of life is a task not only for women, but for all of society, and that it is, in fact, our main common objective.
All right. So hopefully folks were inspired. You can find the whole video on YouTube, and it's called The Self, and I'll put in the chat, or I'll ask Maria to put in the chat the whole video. But incredible, right? Just super inspiring. So it's not just like these theoretical ideas, it's actually feminism in practice. And then the protagonism, right, of campesina women, indigenous women, Black women, young women, queer folks, really at the center, right? And I think that just wanted to say that that's what's so exciting is all across the globe, there's these examples, right? These pilots, these models that are being tested in this moment of crisis, of pandemia, of austerity, being able to provide that alternative at small scale right now, but hopefully to give inspiration and experiment at a broader scale. So a couple more things. I'm going to talk, I'm trying to end this in the next 7 minutes so that we can actually get some Q&A and we can hear from Professor Jennifer De Leon. Ponce de Leon, and so I think it's important to have the questions too. So a couple people, right? So the contributions that the feminist economy does to the current economy is that there's these false dichotomies, right, around and these binaries, and I'm all about breaking binaries right now. So between public and private, around production versus reproduction, and around reason versus emotion, right? And I think that ultimately we have to be able to, like, you know, bring the inside out and turn the outside in, right? Really think about, like, how do we, the challenge of socializing reproductive labor work and being able to value it and give it the center and the focus is really important. That we also think about that there is this social global sexual division of labor, right? And we see that play out in terms of how, you know, even if we take the vaccine distribution and who has access, you know, in terms of like Western sort of more industrialized countries being able to have access versus countries that are going to take years before they're going to be able to vaccinate their peoples, right? Their populations. And that we also understand how that is gendered, right? There's a gendered social division of labor, and there's a lot of theory and history around that. That work and wages within the framework of supply and demand, right? That ultimately that there is a way in which, you know, so when profit is king, that's ultimately how then the value of work is determined. Versus actually, if we put another, you know, care or life or the people at the center, like what does that actually give us, right? How do we then begin to then say, not have these debates around like the Green New Deal or the care economy as being, you know, sort of antithetical to our current system, but actually being something that actually creates more spaces to cool the planet and to have people live with dignity and respect, right? Next slide. That ultimately, you know, it's like this, that our economy cannot run without basically care work, right? Domestic work. It cannot live without actually childcare or elder work or people assisting folks with different abilities, right? That it's really important for us to really think about the centrality of that work and how much, like, trillions of dollars. Studies have been made both by the UN and even last year a lot of research about trillions of dollars that are basically not accounted for in that home and care work. That ultimately, number 5, that we have to be able to have self-defined, free, autonomous bodies, sexualities, and identities, right? That it's not just an identity issue, but it's actually like a part of the feminist framework is really about being able to determine who you are, how you present your gender, how you express your sexuality, and how you actually break free from, you know, sort of the sort of isms of sort of religious supremacy or isms around sort of races, white supremacy and patriarchy and its impact on control over our bodies, right, and expression of it. That we also, that feminist economy also gives us an opportunity to think of the concept and use of time. You know, it's like capitalism is all about production. Capitalism is about consumerism. It's about actually like, you know, what you can produce, and versus being able to think about from a different cosmovision, a different framework around time, not based on exploitation. And that ultimately, you know, like we got to challenge, and what we've seen again also in the pandemic so clearly, like this concept of like, you know, sort of the Anthropocene or the Homo economist, like sort of like humans being the center or individualism, and ultimately us, you know, nature being at our disposal, versus actually very much reframing a very collective, being in right relationship to nature and not actually reproducing the Anthropocene, right? So last 2 slides that I'll share is that this is the patriarchal, colonialist, capitalist, neoliberalist, imperialist system, right? That is, when you have that at the center, capital and profit at the center, it is over-exploitation of nature, over-exploitation of people, over-exploitation of developing countries, of land. It's based on consumers, right? So even when we think about like the stimulus, right? The stimulus is being given out because they want to create more consumers. It's not giving out because they actually care about people's livelihoods, right? That we see that it's based on violent social relationships, right? The role of the state is to basically curb dissent and to control Black, Indigenous, Latinx people, to control migrant, the right to move, right? And that the state and democracy is set up to actually in the benefit and in the service of capital and profit. And then the last slide is really about if, in fact, we put sustainability of life at the center. If we put people, we put the planet, we put basically our sort of care at the center, then what does that then do, right? It gives us sort of the way in which nature is seen as old. Many of our movements have been part of the rights of nature movement, right? Like actually water having a right. And so this has been something that's been happening at the international level in particular, so that, you know, forest and rivers and can be protected and that are not at the disposal of you know, sort of the system for profit, but actually in right relationship. And that's part of the climate crisis that we're in, is because of how we've been in relationship to our ecosystem. That ultimately we create new social relations, right? That ultimately how we relate to each other is based very differently. It's in collectivity, reciprocity, respect, honoring dignity, honoring people's right to be and to express themselves, right? And that ultimately that is really from the home to our community to the place, even redefining work, right? Redefining how we think about work and time. That there is also what we call a political subject. I can't go into it right now, but that's a whole other set of conversations in a slide. But really that begins to say, like, who are the kind of protagonists and who are the keepers of the sustainability of life, right? Right now, it's the corporation, the banks, and the tanks. And ultimately, it's like the political subject, in my perspective, the protagonists of the struggle are Indigenous people, are feminists, are the young climate strikers, are the migrants, are folks that basically have been, again, invisibilized, marginalized, historically, silenced, but that we've been organizing, and that we're the keepers of sort of the new vision, and that it also creates an opportunity for reorganization socially, politically, right? A new social political organization. So how do we then think about cities? How do we think about homes, right? How people live with each other. How do we think about the commons, right? How do we think about even in this pandemic, in what is soon to be hopefully a post-pandemic moment, architecture, right? It's like, how do we begin to think about, again, places where we live and places and how we function? Like, what does like real democracy look like from the ground up, right? What does participatory budgeting look like, so that then people get to decide where if we're going to defund the police, what are we going to invest in, and how do we invest? And I think that's the opportunity that I think this anti-racist, feminist, regenerative, the anti-racist, regenerative, feminist economy gives us. And so that's I'm going to stop there to allow some questions and some comments, but I just want to thank you. Woo!
Thanks so much. It's just really so refreshing and rejuvenating in the climate of austerity to, hear this model that's based on sustainability and solidarity. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm bringing Jennifer in to offer some comments, and then we'll turn to the audience. So if you want to send your comments and questions, Jennifer and Cindy will take a look at them shortly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Cindy. That was such a inspiring and brilliant talk, and there's so many things I wanted to ask you about. But one of the first things I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a bit on was the point of internationalism that you brought up. That seems to me to be so important to what you're doing. And so I wanted to ask you a couple of things about that. One, what demands internationalist commitment puts on us, particularly those of us within the US, given the US's, role as an imperialist power and as kind of a global police state for global capital, or a police state for global capital. So what kind of demands that an internationalist commitment puts on us? And then I also wanted to hear, about kind of what grassroots internationalism really looks like in practice. And finally, kind of thinking of, what are the kind of challenges and possibilities that are posed by, the transnational nature of so many of the corporate and financial interests that are really at the root of the, predations that you're organizing against?
All right, thank you. Very good questions. I don't have all the answers, but I'll try. So I think that maybe I'll start with what does grassroots internationalism looks like. We've had a very deep history in this country of solidarity with movements across the world, like, starting like Abraham Lincoln brigades, like you just name it, you just go down like from the civil rights movement to the, Black Power movement to the 80s, anti-apartheid, solidarity with against intervention in Central America. Well, one of the things that we've been talking about in grassroots global justice is sometimes it's one-dimensional, right? It's sort of like it's like from here to there. And then so much of our conversations with international social movements and through the World Social Forum, people were like, oh, wait a minute, you're like us. People had a lot of times, sort of interactions with white middle-class solidarity folks, and they're like, they're great, amazing, and there's like incredible. There was some incredible contributions, but there was a way in which internationally people don't always understand the struggles, the anti-capitalist struggles that happen within the United States, right, or here in Turtle Island. And I think that that's one thing that was really important for folks to start to see. It's like, oh, we need to be in solidarity with the Black Lives Movement, with the fight against Standing Rock, indigenous peoples who are fighting against Standing Rock, with the Occupy Wall Street, with the Sunrise Movement. And so there's a way in which us visibilizing our struggles and being able to talk about sort of how we're fighting inside the United States, around sort of the policies that we fight against, but then stand in solidarity with other folks around the world, I think is incredibly important. So it's like a two-sided piece where it's like mutual and joint interest, and ultimately us recognizing each other, that, we have our counterparts, that there's like a deep farm worker organizing history. There always has been, but it's not always been visibilized when we talk about sort of the left, and globally our partners not always knowing. And so I think that piece is super important. And that's what we mean by grassroots internationalism, is that there's a way in which it's like, it's not only about like multinational solidarity, but also multiracial, like how we approach even our multiracial organizing is super important, because we're not all the same. We're not trying to be like lowest common denominator and being like, and liquidate our identities, and to be like, it's like, we're not monolithic. It's like, and I think this piece around like indigenous peoples and the multiple nations, and Latinx people and the pan-Latinx sort of identity, and Black folks from the diaspora. It's like, it's not same. And so I think part of that is leaning into that complexity and being able to do that. So part of what then that looks like for us is dual, right? Is that people internationally, like, you will need to make sure that you get Trump out of office. That was the big demand that folks made. They're like, please work your asses off to get Trump out of office. And, some folks are like, oh, electoral politics, that's not our thing. Like, no, it's an international mandate. It was like important to actually hear how important it was to fight it against an authoritarian trend, and then to give hope and inspiration to people fighting against Bolsonaro, Duterte, Modi, and that there is a way in which we're like, this was important to create more political space, also internationally, right? They're worried about Biden and his globalization sort of agenda, but it's not Trump, right? It's not Trump. And I think so that's a concrete way, I think, that sort of looks like. There's also campaigns that are beginning to be articulated that cross borders, right? Taking on transnational institutions, like you said. And we do a lot of work around following the climate negotiations at the UNFCCC. And really, it's like, it's a low bar to get the Biden to join the Paris Agreement. We've lost 5 years, but I think there's so much more. And I think part of that true internationalism really looks like, it's like, are we listening to the landless people in South Africa and the indigenous people in the Amazon, and then folks actually fighting and being like, what does it look like, so that we're not imposing our North American perspective of what we think is going to solve the climate, but it's actually in dialogue and in conjunction with each other, so that we're not putting, it might help us, but then it's at their cost, and that's not what we're trying to do. And I think those are the kind of things that are really important when we think about internationalism now.
Wonderful, thank you. I know there's some questions in the comments. I want to ask you maybe one or two other questions, and then I'll turn to those. One of the things I really appreciated about your presentation was your discussion of, the way that the invisibilization of certain kinds of labor abets its hyper-exploitation, basically, right? And I wanted to ask you, about, if you could just speak a little bit more about like tactics or strategies or specific campaigns dealing with invisibilized labor, be that, obviously reproductive labor, but also I was wondering if, that framework of thinking of invisibilized labor helps us to connect, say, struggles around reproductive labor to, say, struggles around informal or illegalized labor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that is a great question, because like I said, I'm really happy to share that next week, we are supporting and co-endorsing this CARE resolution, right? And that is being championed by Senator Warren and Congressperson Jamal Bowman, and really, and being led and historically led by the National Domestic Workers Alliance, our sister alliance in the Caring Majority and the Caring Across Generations. And really what's been interesting is that we've been doing a lot of work around the Green New Deal. So we're part of the Green New Deal national network. And we've been trying to bring in a feminist articulation to the Green New Deal. And then trying to think about, how do we make this bridge with the demands coming from the domestic workers, right? Around visibilizing care work, healthcare, domestic care, and then care in the home. And, and part of that is that, being able to think about ways in which, so it's not just about like massive investments into infrastructure. Like, that's not what we're talking about in the Green New Deal, right? It's like, yes, there is infrastructure, but it's not just about like the buildings, but it's like massive investment into the care infrastructure, right? And I think that we saw like over 50,000, for example, public health jobs be demolished by the Trump administration. Like, that whole infrastructure, given the pandemic, needs to be rebuilt, and even more deeply so, right? We're talking about demanding making like a jobs core, not temporary jobs, but like union, living wage jobs, to actually deal with the pandemic as we know it's going to be with us for the rest of at least our lifetime, is like, how do we actually think about rebuilding a whole public health infrastructure from a care perspective that then brings in good paying, unionized, visibilized jobs that are so necessary, right? In terms of being able to do that, where there is this like public investment in care work that supports, workers, that gives us an actual historic opportunity to rebuild the economy, again, not for profit, but actually to deal with the material, I think the devastation that people are feeling, right? It's like, look at like how many plumbers are we going to need in Texas and throughout the like South, given what's happened with that polar vortex, like the amazing work that farm workers and people working in the meat industry have done. It's like the price was very high to pay, but I think to me it's like clear, like we cannot sustain, we cannot live and exist without certain level of work that oftentimes, like, I said, is totally devalued, is completely underpaid or not paid. And I think that's the opportunity. And so this CARE resolution is an attempt to actually put front and center what it is that we need, and in terms of policy, but also practice.
Wonderful, thank you. I know we've got at least three Really interesting questions. I want to make sure we get to those. So the first one was from Sydney, and this is a question about whether you think social movements are too fragmented by single issues, or do you think it's useful to have multiple single issue organizations working together?
Great question. So yes, a big part of also the work and my division of labor within the organization is doing actually our United Front work. And so I do that work on a national level and on an international level. And I do think one of the problems I think that we often face is very siloed, right? And I think that the one thing when you first get trained as an organizer, the first thing that you say is like, people are going to come based on their own self-interest, right? It's like, you're going to come because of something that either you're impacted or something that you're experiencing. And then through the process of political consciousness, you start then thinking bigger and get exposed to different things. But I feel like, to me, sometimes our movements get stuck in sort of our particular issue and then don't see the opportunity for cross-pollination and then really racial building in a deeper way, right? And it's like how to be able to be super intentional about how we're building bridges with each other, and then also building beyond the US. And I think that's probably a bigger, I would say, a blind spot for many movements and many organizations in the US, is that we think about it so much in the context of us and not necessarily thinking about, sort of the global impact.
Wonderful. Now, Ricardo had a question that was, so he writes, as I see it, both environmentalism and communism reach their potency and vitality within Latin American, African, and indigenous contexts globally. I am less affirming of queer and feminist work within these spheres, as it provides a venue and opening for our class enemies to usurp our critique for bourgeois ends. How to remain open yet vigilant?
Wow. Okay, Ricardo, this is you taking it to a whole other level. So I appreciate the question. I mean, I think part of why we're part of this process of reclaiming feminisms, because within sometimes, again, the context of history, right? The radical history has been either overlooked, or forgotten, or not highlighted. And I think part of the reclaiming feminisms from the grassroots is those radical roots, right? Is the sort of the total contribution of Marxist feminists, right, from around the world, but also here in this country, and the radical feminists, like particularly women of color feminists, that Third World Women's Alliance, like many of the women who wrote This Bridge Called Our Back, all of these very radical women of color that had an anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist perspective. And I think part of what we've been, sort of we're countering is that bourgeois feminism, and I think sort of, and again, this sort of tendency around like, let's fix what's within the system. And again, Green New Deal is not revolutionary. It's very bold and ambitious, but we see it as a just transition. We see it as a way to get to the more radical economic, the just transition to the next economy. But the conditions are not there yet in this country. And in fact, you've mentioned the Green New Deal, and it's like, oh, that's socialism. It's like a boogeyman or whatever, And I think ultimately there's a lot of work that we have to do. And how do we then create the conditions for then saying, this is why we need a bold, ambitious agenda around jobs and the economy, but from a way to then keep politicizing and then take on those contradictions and some of the right-wing, sort of hysteria that challenges and attacks something like the Green New Deal. The same thing I would say around our, I think to me, it's like people will be like, sort of radical politics is dead, or, sort of the examples around the world. And I was like, yeah, you have to actually like acknowledge what's worked and hasn't worked, but it doesn't mean that we actually shouldn't be an experimentation. And I think that's one of the things why I think it's so important that social movements get to experiment, and then we learn the lessons coming from, Venezuela and from Cuba, from Ecuador, and to be able to say, but this is why we still believe this, and why we believe that we have to actually the model capitalist, white supremacist, racial and gendered capitalism, why it's such a problem, and why we live in a finite planet, and why we actually have to provide an alternative, a systems change alternative. And so I think what's interesting is there's been a lot of conversation of like one size doesn't fit all. And we have to think about ways in which these systems change alternatives are complementary, and how we have to actually test them out on a local and regionalized level. And I think that's what's exciting, is to begin to see some of that play out.
Oh, thank you. Nancy asks, what place do disabled women and disability have in your work, given some of the obvious ways that global capitalist production and its environmental destruction produces disability and affects disabled persons in particular ways?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things is, I think in the framework of how, it's like people who are then, considered not valuable to the system are disposed, right? And again, sort of like the deep history of how, and then the deep organizing of folks in the differently abled and disability community have like sort of pushed at the forefront, right? About sort of what needs, services, agency, like level of like protagonism that I think we've been able to see. And I think particularly the climate crisis, like being able to really visibilize like how many people were impacted with the shutting off of electricity, people on respirators and ventilators, and people who actually need home care workers. And I think that to me, there is absolutely, this is, it goes back to the right to self-determination and bodily autonomy, and the right for people to determine like how I want to live, how I want to be treated, and what does that begin to look like. And, I have a comrade, a good compañera who's the director of Sins Invalid, just did this amazing production on disability and climate, and sort of like how, and it was a challenge. It was actually a challenge to the climate justice movement around actually being ableist, right? And so I think she called us out, including myself. And so like part of it is like, where do we have to actually learn and articulate, and not just have it be just like oh yeah, and that too. It's actually fundamental to how we see, in sort of catastrophes, in ways of living, in the reorganization of relations in society. That's really fundamental.
Wonderful, thank you. I have, I think, maybe one more question for you, but if anybody else who's here has questions, maybe get them in the chat now. I was thinking, and this is, I guess, I have two thoughts I wanted to bring together here. One was, thinking of some of reflections coming in the out of the World Social Forum. Some have kind of argued that there's a need to build, like, have commented on, what do we do? What is the place of parties, for example, in these movements? And so I think that's one question I wanted to ask you, what you see possibilities of working with parties, if and I think that's also related to the other question around, what does a feminist politics, the kind of feminist politics that you embrace, mean for the kind of forms that political organizations take, the type of political action that you're engaged in? Is that part of, is that a kind of perspective that would be useful for thinking about the kind of parties that we want to work with or want to have, for example? If you think, or if not parties, organizations,
Right. Well, great questions. Wow. Hard hitting. So interesting. So I think this question, one of the points is around the new formation of socio-political organizations, right? And I think that's actually really important, like how people organize. Like I believe in all forms of organization and different ways. And I think we're seeing a lot of that even like in mutual aid and communities of care and affection, and being able to think about ways that people organize that then transcend or sort of evolves or transcends into, I don't know what the right word is, but into this question of power and governance. And I think many people on the left are incredibly uncomfortable with that. It's like, and you feel it like with like people being like, oh, electoral politics, that's not my jam, or left absenteeism around electoral politics. But one of the big struggles we had, and I was a volunteer with the Front Line, which was an initiative led by a movement for Black Lives and the Working Families Party and the Rising Majority, is really this thing around like, how do we begin to reimagine radical democracy in a very completely different way, and power building in a different way. And I think it goes to like, what does a feminist articulation to that actually look like? Because it's like sometimes it's so masculine and it's so white and it's so like hierarchical. And I think part of that's that a lot of people don't want to make decisions like that and don't want to sort of structure their lives that way. But I do feel like for me, I think I have felt the absence of being able to belong to something bigger than myself, right? I've been in organizations my whole life, but I haven't been part of a party. I vote in a particular party, I vote Democrat, but it's like, that's not my party, and I feel like, to me, it's like, I aspire to be able to have the form of organization that I could be a part of in the millions, that really reflects my politics and really reflects the kind of governance that I think is needed. And I don't think that exists yet here in this country. And I think we've seen the role of parties in other, liberation struggles in other countries, and the role of then social organizations like the one that I get to work with, right, which are kind of like the constellation of like social movement left folks. But I think that sometimes there's a conflation here in the U.S. because it's like, we're not a party and we don't function that way. But I think it's needed, right? I think it's needed if we actually are going to think about a different way to reorganize society and to have people have a dramatically different way of engaging and having a say beyond just the election, right? Just like the one time a year you get to vote. It actually has to change dramatically. That needs to be a paradigm shift around that. I think the last point around that is that I do think this question of thinking about democracy and the state from a feminist perspective is super important. And I think it's terrain that we're trying to take on in our International Feminist Organizing School, because that's a side of struggle, right? It's like how we fight against different forms of states, right? Or even stateless peoples, right? Like people in the Kurdish people, or the people in the Basque country or Palestine, or the Sahara. It's like Western Sahara. So it's like, how do we understand the way we govern ourselves? And again, not from an anarchistic sort of point of view, but from a way of like, what does it mean to practice democracy and reclaim democracy at multiple levels from the bottom on up?
Thank you. We have this question, a great question. Do you have any thoughts on the relationships between joy and activism, rest and resistance, as seen through an anti-racist and feminist lens?
Oh, yes. One of the things I love about Berta Cáceres, she has this amazing quote around just like, I can't remember it right now, but it's like, basically it's like, at the end of the day, we fight for the right to be happy and to have joy, right? It's like that simple, and I think it's like the right to life, right livelihood, the right to be in right relationship is because ultimately it is around being able to have joy and rest and connection. And I think that's what the pandemic has like, and sort of all of the shit, basically all of the Trump in the last 4 years and all the stuff that we fight around is like taken that away, and this pandemic is like really compromised our ability to like connect. And I think we're going to have to really theorize and practice like as I don't want to be like, let's go back to normal. I think that's actually a really wrong framework, but it's actually like, what is the new normal that's based on very different levels of well-being and this notion of resilience and this notion of joy, right? Because that I think is so important. At the end of the day, it's like we have to have a happiness index, right? It's like that's what measures, not the GDP or like how we're doing on the stock market. It's like, how happy are you and how happy are people? And it's like, and again, that might be utopian, but it's like, you got to keep the vision and the hope alive, in terms of really believing that there's a different way to reorganize society, to have those principles and practices be real. And it has to be collective. And I think that's the thing, that so much of this has been individualized. You know, self-care has been commodified in a lot of ways. And it's like so much of our work is like healing collectively. And there's some internal work you got to do individually, but so much of it is done through community and through family and communities of care and affection.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I think we're about ready to wrap up, right? Thank you so much, Cindy. It was just an absolute pleasure to listen to you.
Yeah, thank you both for this really rich conversation. I just want to make a quick plug for the other two talks as part of the series this week. On Thursday, we have Kim Tallbear giving a keynote, and on Friday, Alyssa Battistoni. So Cindy, thank you for this stellar opening to our week dedicated to ecofeminism, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you all. Thank you. Gracias.